Hello, everyone. We want to welcome you to our 22nd session of eNoam tonight. And this is a very unique platform for several reasons. First of all, it's a platform that is really a together platform of Jews, Christians, and all who want to join us and be a part of a discussion. Secondly, it's a discussion platform. So we actually have breakout sessions in this platform, and you will have the opportunity to share your thoughts on the questions that are asked tonight. And thirdly, and most importantly, you are a very important part of what we are building here. And Rob Johnny tonight, he is with us, and he's going to be talking to us tonight about an amazing topic, one that I think is going to challenge each and every one of us, and that is trust. And so as we build together, we want to thank you again for being with us, and we want to begin. Rabbi Johnny Solomon, would you like to lead us tonight in this amazing discussion?
Okay, so firstly, thank you for a very dynamic and exciting introduction. Secondly, I have to offer you forgiveness because we've just come to the close of actually a long day of fasting here in Israel. Yes. These are one of the fast days that commemorate the events towards the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. In fact, in addition to that, we also commemorate today the breaking of the tablets of Moses when he saw the golden calf. So because it's a hot day and it's a long day, I only just recently finished my fast, so hopefully we'll get by with a glass of water. And I'm looking forward to explore the topic of bitachon, trust. And before we proceed, it's important to note there are many different types of trust. There's trust in others and trust in yourself. Our focus tonight is bitachon, trust in God. So to what extent are people of faith, in fact, truth be told, to what extent are all people supposed to trust God? And what we're going to do is explore a number of biblical narratives where this question of trust arises, and where various commentaries raise the query as to whether the particular actor in that story, the particular individual making choices, showed sufficient bitachon, trust in God. And as a result of that, hopefully we're going to reach somewhat of a conclusion about where we draw the line relating to what we do and what we should expect to be doing as human beings. What amount of human endeavor, or what we call in Hebrew, hishtadlut, would be invested in particular moments or situations? And to what extent should we simply cease to act and simply trust the word of God? So let's review the biblical passages we're going to be exploring tonight. And here we're having a fairly broad menu of different psukim, different verses. Verses from the book of Genesis, Bereshit, with Abraham descending to Egypt, describing Jacob's fear when his brother is about to encounter him with a big army, and Joseph's request when sitting in prison. We'll then segue to the book of Exodus, the book of Shemot, describing the story of the Exodus from Egypt. And it's at that point we'll address the question I raised in the teaser video. And it's at that point we'll try and have a breakout session. We'll then briefly speak about the story of the spies and conclude with a verse from the book of Proverbs. Just before we proceed, by the way, this series that we've explored different midot, different traits, you may have noted that oftentimes I'll quote or make reference to the book of Proverbs, which is itself a book all about traits and values and ethics. And it's one which I believe we spend too little time reading, but we would do well to do so. But let's begin, and we now jump into the story not long after Abraham and Sarah have come to the land of Canaan, according to that commandment that God gave to them in Genesis chapter 12, to leave their original homeland and to journey to the land that God would show them. And we read the opening verses there where they make that journey, showing tremendous trust in God. I mean, to go to a place you don't know where you're going to, to take a journey across the Middle East with no idea of your destination, to leave all that is familiar to you simply because God has told you to do, definitely demonstrates trust in God. And yet, just a few verses later on, we read that there was a famine in the land of Canaan. And I, as a reader, would have expected people of great faith who have been told that when they go to this great land called Canaan, that all would be well with them, would kind of say, well, we should trust in God that while there is a famine here, it won't negatively affect us. We should trust in God that though we've come to this point and there's a lack of food, there's a lack of water, we should trust that God will provide for us. But that's not actually what Abraham and Sarah do. Instead, they descend to Egypt. And that leads to a whole different moral question, which we see here in Genesis chapter 12, verse 13, where Abraham asks Sarah to pretend she be his sister so that he not be killed. But that's a different question. In particular, the question that I'd like to raise, at least present, is one of trust. Why didn't Abraham trust in God that all would be well in the land of Egypt? Why didn't he show the same kind of faith at this point in time than he did just a few years previously when he traveled from Ur-Kasdim to Canaan? So before we look at a suggested commentary, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Did Abraham abrogate his trust in God? Did Abraham fail to show sufficient trust in God? What are your thoughts?
I've always wondered what the answer is.
Okay.
I'm wondering if when he left he heard a voice, and it was something that he was very impressed by. But when he gets to Canaan, maybe he didn't hear a voice. So he fell back on his own reasoning to figure out what to do. And I know sometimes that happens with us, that we feel very strongly God wants us to do something, but in other situations, we don't know what God wants us to do. So we try to figure it out.
That's a really, really interesting suggestion. And actually, it aligns with a lot of what we know about the difference between the journey outside of Israel and the life inside of Israel. Ironically, the way the commentaries explain, there were much more impressive public miracles outside the land of Israel. The crossing of the Red Sea, right? The 10 plagues, even the crossing of the Jordan, all those kind of things, the manna and the wells. And when the Israelites entered the land of Israel under the leadership of Joshua, they had to fight. They had to work hard to conquer the land. Why did God not do such great miracles? The manna ended. They had to, grow food. And a number of commentaries suggest that that is exactly the point. The life outside the land of Israel was profoundly miraculous, but by being supernatural, it was less ordinary. Whereas life inside the land of Israel was more ordinary, but that made it, shall we say, more normal. And so, yes, outside the land of Israel, they may have heard the voice. Inside the land of Israel, perhaps they didn't. I think that's a great suggestion. Any further queries, questions?
Well, I find it very interesting, for example, that when Isaac also has a famine, he goes down as he starts to go down, and then God tells him, stay. So it might suggest perhaps that you have to really endeavor on your own until God tells you otherwise.
That could be a suggestion. I'll tell you what Nachmanides says, and Nachmanides was a great commentary about 800 years ago from Spain. Nachmanides himself suggests that Abraham did err. He did sin. He says, know that Abraham, our father, unintentionally committed a great sin. And he says both on account of asking his wife to pretend she was his sister, we mentioned that, but also on account of the fact that he left the land of Israel. because, as he says, for in famine God would redeem him from death. According to Nachmanides, Abraham should have shown greater faith and greater trust, and he didn't. Now, interestingly, I'm mentioning this opinion. There are others who see the story differently, and they say, precisely as was suggested before, that when you don't know what to do, your job is to apply human logic, and human logic is when there is a famine, go find food. And what we come to see is that many of the stories in the Bible are all about raising this age-old question of when do you do what's logical in your eyes, and when do you have trust in God and believe that all will be well, even if you expect a supernatural miracle. Abraham made that choice. Some people say it was the right one. Some people say it wasn't. But that is itself an interesting question. Let's move on to another story. Again, we'll see on the same theme. You may well know that before Jacob encountered his brother, they had this big sibling rivalry, because Jacob took the blessing and the blessing from his father by deceiving Isaac and pretending that he was Esau. And Esau was very, very angry, and he wished to pursue to kill him. And soon enough, Jacob finds out many years later that his brother is en route and he's planning to kill him. By this point, Jacob had married, had many children, and his brother comes with 400 men. And he thinks, well, I'm about to get, in a battle and may well lose. And if we look at the final verse, I think it's actually verse 8, it says, then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, and he divided the people who were with him and the flocks and herds and the camels into two bands. Meaning what he did was he strategically divided his family so that even if some got harmed by Esau and his men, others would remain safe. But the commentaries raise an interesting question. Here too, Jacob had previously been promised by God that all would be well with him, that he would receive the blessings, and he'd be able to arrive back to the land of Israel, and he would be able to raise a big family, and this family would be known as a Bnei Israel, because his name was Israel, so they were his children. And so why was Jacob afraid? Surely he should have trusted in God. Why did Jacob take these make these moves of dividing his family into two, of strategizing, of separating them? Why didn't he simply say, whatever will happen will be for the best, and I believe that God will protect me? And this too becomes one of the great theological questions arising in the book of Genesis, in the book of Bereshit. Why didn't Jacob have more faith? Can you see there's a kind of a similarity with this in the Abraham story? Here too, Jacob is presented with a conundrum, with a threat. Previously, he has shown faith in God, but here he seems to apply human endeavor, that Hebrew word, hishtadlut, ahead of trust, namely bitachon. So was Jacob's calculation right? Did he get the balance right? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think this is like you said, this is one of the basic questions for a believing person. Meaning, if we take this one step forward, I can say, maybe I don't need to go to work, because if God wants me to have money, I'll just win the lottery. But each one of us, we are doing our own part of what we think is right. Because at least for me, I think, just like I know I pray for God, for certain things, I also know in the same time that God does not owe me anything. Meaning he does not have to answer my prayers, or maybe he thinks something differently than me. So that's why I need to have my my effort, my part of reality.
I would like to raise this question also to the level of a nation, not just a person. When Israel came back to the land from exile, there were many attempts to come back that did not succeed. And even when we came back, let's say in the last 100 years, it was really quite against all odds, both in terms of famine. It was not the place, the land was quite desolate. and also in terms of the enemies that did everything possible to prevent us from coming back to this land. So we see that there is a certain, even when we have to make a tremendous effort in order to achieve something, we also have to believe that God wants us to do it, because otherwise that effort will be in vain.
Right. I mean, obviously, that's in the sense of feeling that your effort is justified. The question really is, should we be making effort in the first place? Maybe, and there are even so those who make this argument about the land of Israel today, maybe one should make no effort and say the Messiah will come and take me there. And until that happens, my job is to stay put. My job is to show trust that if God wants me somewhere, God will take me somewhere.
Yeah, but like you said, in the conquest of the land in the first place, God made it very clear that it was our job, that we are partners in this process, and we have to do our hishtadlut. We have to do our effort.
Right. So this is interesting question. You know, in a marriage or even a business partnership, sometimes it takes a while for each of the partners to know exactly what each of their roles are. And when you think at the story of Abraham that we looked at before, I think that's what that question raises. It is, where do you draw the line between Abraham's trust and God's provision, right? Or Abraham's effort and God's provision? And similarly too with Jacob. Is it great? Is it better to show trust and do nothing? Is it better to show trust and do something? Where do you draw the line? What is the human role in terms of making events come to fruition?
Well, I think it's I think it's very interesting in both cases, and in particular in this case, that first of all, Jacob, we see that he prays along the way, so we know that he's connected to Hashem. But he has also this internal protective nature for his family. Mm. And this is something that is innate, I believe, within men, that they have this responsibility to provide and to protect. And it's an attribute that is very powerful. And it gives a woman this incredible sense of security. And you see that Abraham's motive, apart from what he does with Sarah, but his motive obviously is to make sure his family is fed. And here Yaakov, it's protecting his family because he feels there could potentially be a threat. And he protects them to such a degree, but he's going to have to deal with his own Yetzer Hara. He has that Yetzer Tov, which is spiritual, but he has his own Yetzer Hara, and he has fears. He has faced these issues before. And this is something that's coming to haunt him. He had to flee from his family because of the threat of Esav, and now it's coming back. So he's going to have to grab the cloak of Hashem in such a way that we see his entire nature is changed. And I think it's just an amazing that God is boxing him in such a way that the transformation is what's going to birth the nation. I don't know.
So firstly, thank you so much for sharing. There's some other feedback. I don't know if people want to share.
Yeah, I'm trying to mute everyone. Everyone stay muted unless you're going to be speaking. Okay? Thank you. Okay, Rabbi.
So let's see, though, an interesting commentary. This comes from Meir Levush Malbim, who was a Russian commentary about 150 years ago. And here he uses, I've translated it, bitachon, meaning human endeavor. And he says, a person who has bitachon, meaning human endeavor, has no fear of man. Fear shows that he doesn't have proper bitachon. Fear, bitachon is trust. I'm sorry. A person who has trust has no fear of man. Fear shows that he doesn't have proper trust. The fact that Jacob, Yaakov, was afraid was the reason why he was also distressed. He realized that his fear showed that his trust was not perfect. Therefore, he was not deserving of miracles. Therefore, he was forced to operate within the realm of nature and prepare for war. Now, what he's saying is that Jacob arrived at this situation with insufficient trust in God. And now, how is that expressed? That he was afraid. Because if you have sufficient trust in God, you shouldn't feel fear. So because he felt fear, he had a sense to himself that maybe he'd chosen the path of human endeavor ahead of divine trust. And that's why he then invested further energies of preparing the people and planning and dividing them so that each would be safe. What you can see here is this commentary too is raising this question of did he get it right? And Merlebush Malbim isn't saying, I think he got it right because I say so. He's saying because Jacob was afraid suggests that he got it right. Got it wrong, sorry, because a person who's afraid clearly lacks a certain trust in God, which itself, of course, is a profound testimony. True trust in God means you never feel fear. I will fear no evil because you are with me. If you do fear, then maybe you don't feel God is so present.
So what you're really saying here, or what he is saying here, is that when God promises him that he will be okay, he's saying, if you trust in me, then you will be okay. That seems to be what he's saying.
Yep. And that's itself a very, very interesting perspective. Meaning your emotions are a guide of the path you've chosen. If you feel fear, you've not fully chosen trust.
I'll tell you something that my wife always says, which I really identify with, and that is that we have to, trusting God means that we have to do everything possible to be worthy of, of his taking care of us. And so I think here in the story of Jacob, for example, in the beginning, he does all these things, but then he has this struggle with another man or an angel, not really clear. And through that struggle, he suddenly transforms. He transforms to the degree that he is told that he will no longer be called Jacob, he will be called Israel. So in other words, to me, it seems to me that this struggle, which was kind of incidental, right? I mean, he wasn't actually looking for the struggle, and it suddenly happened to him. It was perhaps this struggle that had the greatest impact on Esau when he finally met him, because he sees that he has changed, that he is not the same person who did everything underhandedly before when he knew him. So it would appear that here again, he actually transformed. He did something that was spiritually significant with himself, and then not only did God help him not be destroyed by Esau, but Esau actually welcomes him and invites him to come and visit with him. So in other words, his transformation may have had the greatest impact, or may have made it possible for God to help him here, simply because he was really aligning himself more with God.
I totally understand that the story can be read in many ways. I mean, the fact is that we ourselves were just reading it and we said perhaps he's shown trust because he's in that moment and believing all will be well, but still being cautious. Rabbi Malbim basically takes a view that the fact he felt fear was a lacking. You're arguing, Yael, that the way in which the story pans out suggests, really the ending suggests that his actions were correct, but it's hard to know because we don't know what the parallel story would be had he shown more trust. Nevertheless, my point is not necessarily to criticize or to suggest criticisms of the patriarchs or matriarchs per se, although the Jewish commentaries were always prepared to do so if they felt it appropriate. But to raise a point that this question of trust and human endeavor is a running theme in the Bible. In fact, we see it on one further occasion where Joseph remains in prison. And do you remember he makes a request and he says, please when you leave the prison, and who is he speaking to? Do you remember which? Is it the butler or the baker? Which one? Sorry?
It's going to be the butler.
Right. So when he leaves prison, he says to him, please make sure you remember me, make sure you mention my name to Pharaoh. And some commentaries say, well, that's impressive. You know, he's really trying his best to get out of prison. Others are similarly critical to him as they were with Jacob, as they were with Abraham, saying, true trust should have meant that wherever you are is where you need to be. So here too is a further story where this question raises its head, where this query becomes part of our thinking and reasoning. So the question that I'd like to now consider is, so how do we solve this? You know, what's the right thing to do? And this brings us to the text that I mentioned in a teaser video. It's a text which actually I think we pay less attention to, but it provides a window into this fascinating question of bitachon, trust in God, and hishtadlot, human endeavor. And at the end of the Exodus, having seen God slay the firstborn in Egypt, seen these 10 plagues, we're told something remarkable in verse 18 here, which says, and God led the people around by way of the desert to the Red Sea, which is just interesting. And the children of Israel were armed when they went out of Egypt. Now, the very fact that the verse feels it necessary to inform us that the children of Israel took out weapons, swords, or things like that when they left Egypt suggests that when they left, they were fearful of what they would encounter in the wilderness. So this leads us to a very, very simple question. It's a question which I raised in a teaser video, and one which I'd like us to discuss now in a breakout session, which is, having seen how God performed each of the 10 plagues in Egypt, including with the death of the firstborn, why did the children of Israel feel the need to leave Egypt armed? Why didn't they just trust in God to protect them? So what I'd like us to do is now have our breakout session, but be informing our remarks based on the story of Abraham, based on the story of Jacob, based on the story of Joseph, about that question which really appears throughout the story of throughout the book of Genesis, namely, how do you get the balance right between bitachon, trusting God, and hishtadlut, human endeavor? So, Kim, is that possible that we can have some breakout sessions?
Yes, absolutely.
Now, previously, 5 minutes didn't seem to be enough. I'm wary of 10 minutes, otherwise we'll just kind of like lose everything. Can we make a compromise and go for 8?
Okay.
And
I'll time this.
We'll see if it works. But it's a relatively simple question, which is, why do we think that it was in the mind of the Israelites when they were leaving Egypt to go and get weapons? They've seen what God's done for them. They've seen the miracles God's performed them. And that would suggest that they need to do nothing. They certainly don't need some rusty Egyptian-made sword as they enter the wilderness. They should just believe that God will protect them from all troubles and sorrows. Okay, so firstly, welcome back. And thank you so much for taking the time to have the breakout rooms. I hope that 8 minutes was better than the 5 minutes we've done previously. Before we go, in fact, you know what? In my group, Margaret raised a fantastic question, which I'd love her to present. But before we do that, because I think it's a more general question, any particular feedback about the specific question, about the wisdom and the choice of the Israelites to go and take arms as they left Egypt?
Well,
maybe, yeah, Rabbi Johnny, when we read Exodus 13, from 15 to 18, it doesn't seem to clearly spell out whether they carried weapons.
So one second, let's have a look at let me share my screen. Often things get lost in translation. The word v'chamushim is interpreted as armed. I suspect you're right that some may interpret it differently. In fact, I believe that some interpret it in terms of the quantity of the Israelites who left Egypt.
Okay.
So, for example, some people suggest that a significant proportion of the Israelites remained in Egypt and didn't actually leave, and only some came out, and they derive it from this verse, whereas others interpret this word as being armed. So you're right. Obviously, if one says that this word doesn't mean that, then the question itself dissolves, which is a reasonable response and reasonable rebuttal. Interesting, I should add, from my perspective, it would seem crazy for somebody to leave Egypt armed because they just saw all these great miracles. But let's not forget that not long afterwards, they do actually have to have a battle. They battle with Amalek, who attacks the Israelites. Meaning there's something quite remarkable, even putting aside the meaning of this word, right? Let's even presume that they didn't take out weapons. So we're all on the same page. Isn't it strange that they go from a status where God is doing everything for them? They don't need to worry. And then very soon into a battle where they're very worried. The emotional and spiritual roller coaster of the Jewish people very much is going up and down. And in some instances, they're told, don't worry, God will look after you. That's what happens with the crossing of the Red Sea. You should remain quiet. Don't worry, God will protect you. And in other situations, they are expected to fight into battle. And there does seem to be not just these questions of choices, like the Abraham question, the Jacob question, and the Joseph question, but also contrasts of stories where God does everything and stories where God does less. And this again highlights the centrality of this question in terms of the Bible. Any thoughts about this?
Yeah, maybe Rabbi Johnny, as you explained, as reminded of the Battle of Amalek, you see a partnership of sorts between the physical and the supernatural, where Joshua is fighting with the army, and you have Moses on top of the mountain, lifting his hands. And as his hands are up, Joshua is winning. As his hands go down, the army is losing. So maybe there is a need for both the natural effort, of course, backed with God's help.
Right. I think that story is actually one of the most important in the Bible, because I think it's from there that we learn the need for both. As if when God has done all these things for the Israelites, they get a bit of a shock when they leave and things don't go automatically to plan, when they have to battle. Similarly, the commentary suggests the same thing when they arrive in Marah. We read that also not long afterwards. Having left Egypt, they go to a place where there's bitter water. You think, well, that's not particularly nice. You've left a place where you've been able to eat and drink and have some measure of food for all those years. And now you've gone to a place where there is nothing. You have this kind of almost shock of a lack of provision. And that, of course, then leads to people complaining in the provision of the well and the manna. But one of the commentaries mentioned, Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, he says the reason for doing so is about teaching the people to grow. You know, when you're a baby, everything is done for you. As you get older, you have to do more for yourself. The Bible is a story of the growing up of a nation. And it's the ebbing away of the day-to-day hand of God, the trust God places in the people to fend for themselves while he too fends for them as well. There is basically throughout all the chapters of the Bible, a recalibration taking place. Just like when children grow up, there's a recalibration. When my children were younger, they needed me to take them everywhere and do everything for them. Nowadays, they say, don't wait up for me, Dad. And I'm thinking, what? Since when did that happen? When did the child become so independent they tell a parent not to wait up for them? And that's called growing up. And that's what we see with the children of Israel. But Margaret, I'd love you to raise a question that we discussed in our session. You asked a big question about 2 or 3 major words.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi Johnny. In our group, I asked, what's the difference between faith and trust?
I've used those words interchangeably. But Margaret said, 1 second, they're not quite the same thing. Now, I've given my suggestion to in our group. Anybody else, before I let you know what my feelings are, anybody else want to tell us what they think the difference is between faith and trust? Different words are used in the Bible for them. That generally means that they mean slightly different things.
I would say faith is belief in, while trust is confidence in.
Right. I kind of said something very similar, David. I said faith is belief in God. Trust is belief in God will fulfill God's promises. But
the confidence.
Yeah, that kind of same thing. There's one of the God concept, and one is a reliance, as you say, confidence in, right? And they're different. There are many people who believe in God, but they lack trust in God. And the Bible informs us that you need both. Sorry, please.
I would say that faith is a spiritual is a spiritual concept, while trust is more of a psychological concept. I don't know if that makes sense. One is, I believe that our faith is at a higher level because it is spiritual. That's what I'm.
Interesting. Okay.
I think that you raised, though, a very serious question, Rav Johnny, which I think also helps us clarify the difference. If we are supposed to grow up, and when we're younger, of course, we do less because we're not capable of doing more, and our Father above takes care of his children. But as the children grow up and they become more independent and more capable, then God, of course, allows them to do more. So when you talk about confidence in, it's confidence about something that hasn't really been defined. It's not like very clear where God, how far God expects us to do on our own, and where exactly, and in what way He's going to help us carry out what we have to carry out. So with faith, it's like faith in, but with trust, you have to actually decide for yourself where that line is and trust that you have correctly understood where this this line of partnership really is. It's
right, and you know, what's interesting is, again, as here I speak as a parent, it's a constant iteration which each person kind of almost needs to constantly renegotiate. A bit like, you know, bedtime becoming late every couple of years. So too, our expectation of God and God's expectation of us changes over time as we grow as a people, as we grow as a nation. And so we need to always be asking this question based on where we are and based on, you know, what stage we are, shall we say, in the divine-human relationship. So, yes.
Also, just a quick thing on the arms. That's a great discussion. You know, there's a very interesting word, that the word sevaot is used very often when God is referring to Bnei Israel in Egypt, to the children of Israel in Egypt. He says, I'm going to lay my hand on Egypt and I'm going to bring out my armies. Mm-hmm. And so the word army means that God is preparing them for something, and that he's going to prepare them to fight. Right. So, and it's funny that today the biggest strength of Israel is the fact is our IDF. It's this, it hasn't changed in thousands of years, that we have to have faith, we have to have trust, but we are always being put in positions where we have to fight.
That's unfortunately, yeah, a truism even till this day. But of course, the question really is, How do you do that while not presuming, and this is what the prophets used to criticize the people for, that you think it's your strength that's doing it?
Right.
Really,
right.
the whole point is you may well have an army, but know that I am guiding you. You may well have, resources, but know that I who's providing for you. So what I'd like to do is reflect on...
Bordis has raised his hand.
Please, please, please. Perfect. Again, I didn't see.
No, I know.
Yes.
I'm trying to be helpful.
Thank you.
Please. Yes.
Thank you so much. That's a very interesting question. And when I look at it, what it makes me think of is the many times that Jesus came across those that needed to be healed or desired something from him. And he always concluded his healing with, your faith has healed you. And so for me, it is that faith for these folks, or for these people, was faith is the ability to do. That is, Jesus has the ability to do, and the trust is that he will do it.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Right. I think that distinction is so important.
That's really interesting.
And again, and I'm so appreciative to Margaret for raising this question, because often people of faith talk of faith, and that's great. But people of faith are actually people of faith and trust. And trust is actually the thing that kind of almost affect even more things that they do and don't do. Faith is about what you identify as, who you turn to. Trust is where you stop and you say, from then on, it's up to you. It's that confidence, as we say. So I think I'm really appreciative of this wider conversation, because it's not one I think I've seen often, and one I do believe it's essential and certainly central to this question of bitachon, of trusting God versus ishtadlut, human endeavor. Whereas I am of time, though, I do want to just share with you a few more things. And I want to quote from you from also a great Jewish Bible commentary, in this case called Rabbeinu Bachya. And Rabbeinu Bachya, he tells us that according to the plain meaning of the verses, the Jews left Egypt armed like an army prepared for battle. I told you that there's different ways of reading those words, and I thank Edward for pointing that out. While it is true that the Jews are not like the other nations that have to fight battles against their enemies, the Torah requires that they act to some degree in a natural manner first. Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon, expressed this idea in Mishlei, in the book of Proverbs, when he said, the horse is prepared for the day of battle, but salvation comes from God. In other words, men are obligated to guard their lives naturally by utilizing horses and weapons. It is only after this that God saves, since victory is solely up to him. Now, when you think about this, what this suggests is there was a fundamental disagreement in the 12th, 14th centuries between the different rabbis of Europe about where you draw the line. Let's go back to what we quoted before. Do you remember Malbim? Malbim said that Jacob was wrong because he feared, therefore there was a failing. And so, given that he didn't have enough trust, therefore Jacob acted in the realm of the natural. What does Rabbeinu Bachya say? He says you need to act naturally and then God will provide. Meaning this is one of those chicken and egg questions. What comes first? According to Malbim, trust in God must always come first, and then what remains should be human endeavor. According to Rabbeinu Bachya, human endeavor should come first, and trust in God will follow. And now we have too limited time to necessarily tease out these nuances. But when we read verses such as this one from Proverbs, the horse is prepared for the day of battle, but salvation comes from God. That relationship between one and the other is, I think, a very curious one. Let's briefly and rapidly move a little bit further, because I want to at least mention the story of the spies. You know, they send the spies to scout out the land of Israel in the book of Numbers, in the book of Bamidbar. And this leads We won't need to probe all the verses. I presume we're familiar with that story. And Rabbi Eliyahu Dessler, he says the episode of the 10 spies is a classic example of a mistake in the balance between faith and endeavor. He believes that there should have been more trust and more faith and less human endeavor. But of course, others would read the story differently. And ultimately, when it comes down to it, I want to turn back to the book of Proverbs, which we already quoted once in our session. The book of Proverbs says, Liyot b'Hashem mivtachecha hodaticha yom afata. That your trust may be in the Lord, I have made known to you this day, even to you. On which Eliyahu of Vilna, known as the Vilna Gaon, comments, the main reason for giving the Torah to Israel was to place their trust in God. Ultimately, there seems to be different approaches in terms of what comes first. Is it trust or is it human endeavor? We saw, for example, that if we understand the words of weaponry literally, then in fact it did pay off, because as soon the people then had to battle at the same time in that battle, they were reminded by looking at the arms of Moses to trust in God. But your trust may be in the Lord, I've made known to you this day, even to you. God expects that we trust. God expects that there comes a point when we simply say, God, in you I trust. In you I turn. And let me give you a very, very real and concrete, and I mean that in a double leveled meaning, example of this. I presume you've been gripped with the news about what's taken place in Surfside in Miami. I don't have any particular roots to Miami, but this story has certainly shaken me to my core, of people living in a building, people of all different backgrounds and races, faiths and religions, and they've unfortunately suffered a terrible, terrible calamity. And what is the world doing? The world is doing both things. There are people working 24/7 to try and hope to find survivors. And there are people praying and praying and praying. We need both. And what's remarkable is you're not just hearing that from faith leaders. I was listening to the announcement of the mayor of Miami-Dade just earlier today, and she was saying, I need the people to pray, and I need people to do all they can to help us. And we need both. Always we need both. How they're expressed, and whether we get the balance right, that's always a question. But we always need to have faith in God, have trust in God, but we do need human endeavor, especially when we see people in need, especially when there's a famine, or especially when there's a threat. We shouldn't simply think that all will be well. And I personally side towards the approach of Rabbeinu Bachya, that through human endeavor, we're showing our faith in God.
I agree.
So those are some thoughts. Any further thoughts from yourselves?
I just want to say that thank you. I absolutely agree. I think they're mutually interconnected. That and I'm reminded of when Moshe Rabbeinu, when he says, you know, when the children of Israel are against the sea and the Pharaoh's army is behind them, he says, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord in the English. And God says to him, what? Why are you asking? You go forward, move, act. And I want to say also the community in Surfside, that's my community.
I didn't know that. Wow.
Rabbi Lipsker. And it's a very, very difficult situation. But my friend texted last night and she said, we're doing everything we can. And that's faith and trust that something good will come. But yeah.
Well, our thoughts are with the people of Surfside and people you know. It's a story that's gripping the world. And I have to say, I'm very inspired by a community, one which I don't know, I've never been there, where all the leaders in their different ways have really reiterated that same message, which is we're working physically hard. Human endeavor, we need it, but we need your prayers, right? Yeah. We need your hope. We're pragmatic, we're not foolish. We know that unfortunately it's likely to be that there will be some bad news to come, but we still want you to pray. And that's really what it means to be somebody who finds, at least attempts to find, that balance between bitachon, trust, and hishtadlut, human endeavor.
Beautiful.
So friends, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much. And thank you for all your contributions and for your great questions. And I look forward to learning with you again.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Beautiful session.
Thank you, Rabbi Johnny.
Pleasure. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov, Edward. All right. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.